discrimination. This is fake. A damn good fake. Where did you get it?
Yeah, impersonating a federal officer. That's a serious crime.
You are accusing me of impersonating a federal judge?
The sun was a warm, golden weight on the city, the kind of perfect late spring afternoon that made the glass and steel canyons of downtown seem less like a concrete jungle and more like a cathedral to ambition. For Judge Aaliyah Vance, it was the end of another long day in the relentless machinery of federal justice. Her black sedan, a model of understated German engineering, hummed quietly as it navigated the final turn into the private drive of the Sterling, a residential tower that pierced the sky like a polished obsidian needle. The building was more than her home, it was her sanctuary, a fortress of tranquility meticulously earned through 2 decades of unassailable integrity and intellectual rigor. Each pane of its gleaming facade, each perfectly manicured shrub in its courtyard, was a testament to a life built on order, reason, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. At 48, Aaliyah carried herself with an aura of composed authority that was second nature. It was in the straight line of her back, the deliberate way she moved, the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes that missed nothing. Today she wore a cream-colored blazer over a simple black sheath dress that fell just to her knees, her daily armor for the courtroom, professional and impeccable. Her dark, curly hair was cut in a short, elegant style that framed a face defined by high cheekbones and a jawline that spoke of determination. As she stepped out of the car, the scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of sandalwood and jasmine, mingled with the clean, warm air. It was the last vestige of the controlled environment of her chambers, a final note of a day spent dissecting statutes and weighing the fates of others. She handed her keys to the valet, a young man who greeted her with a respectful, "Good afternoon, Judge Vance." The greeting was a small, familiar comfort. Here, she wasn't a symbol or a demographic. She was a resident, a known quantity, a part of the quiet, orderly ecosystem. The Sterling prided itself on its discretion and security. Its residents, surgeons, tech executives, and, in her case, a federal judge, paid a premium for the guarantee of privacy and peace. They paid for a world where the chaos of the city stopped at the grand, brass-handled doors. The lobby was a cavern of cool marble and hushed tones, where the only sound was the gentle murmur of a hidden waterfall feature. Aaliyah nodded to the concierge behind the polished mahogany desk and headed for the resident's elevator bank. Her briefcase, filled with briefs for tomorrow's docket, felt heavy in her hand. Her mind was already shifting gears from legal precedent to the simple, welcome banalities of an evening at home. A glass of chilled white wine, a light meal, perhaps an hour with a novel that had nothing to do with law or crime. She longed for the moment she could slip out of her heels, shed the weight of the blazer, and simply be Aaliyah, not Your Honor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, satisfying chime, inviting her into the quiet, wood-paneled car. She stepped inside, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Home. She was almost home. The journey to apartment 32B, her perch above the city, was a vertical decompression chamber, lifting her away from the noise and the fray. But as the doors began to slide shut, a hand shot out, stopping them. The abrupt motion was startling in the serene environment. The doors retracted to reveal 2 police officers. They were young, both white, and they moved with the kind of stiff, self-important swagger that often came with a new uniform and a heavy belt. One was tall and lean, with a severe, close-cropped blonde haircut and pale, watchful eyes. The other was shorter, stockier, with a thick neck and a face that seemed perpetually flushed with a low-grade aggression. They stepped into the elevator, bringing with them the sharp, metallic scent of their equipment and an unspoken tension that immediately soured the air. The small space, designed for quiet contemplation, suddenly felt cramped and charged with an alien energy. They didn't nod. They didn't offer a polite greeting. They simply stood there, their presence a stark, uniformed intrusion into her sanctuary. Aaliyah gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement and pressed the button for the 32nd floor, her finger tracing the illuminated number. A familiar sense of unease, a low, cold hum she had learned to recognize over a lifetime, began to vibrate just beneath her skin. This feeling was an old, unwelcome acquaintance, the silent questioning of her presence, the assessment of her right to occupy a space. It was a feeling she had conquered in courtrooms and boardrooms, but one that still ambushed her in the unguarded moments of daily life. The elevator doors finally closed, sealing the three of them inside the small, gilded box. The ascent began, and with it, the slow, terrifying descent into a nightmare that would prove that even a fortress of marble and glass was no defense against the oldest and ugliest of human poisons. The silence in the elevator was heavy, unnatural. The gentle hum of the machinery, usually a soothing background noise, now seemed to amplify the tension. Judge Vance stood at the back of the car, her briefcase held firmly in one hand, her purse in the other. She focused on the floor indicator, watching the numbers climb. 5, 6, 7. It was a small, mundane detail, a point of focus to anchor herself against the rising tide of anxiety. The officers had positioned themselves near the control panel, not quite blocking her exit, but creating an undeniable human barrier. Their proximity was intimidating, a calculated occupation of space designed to assert dominance. They weren't just sharing an elevator, they were claiming it. The taller officer, whose name tag read Miller, broke the silence. His voice was flat, devoid of courtesy. "Which floor are you headed to, ma'am?" The question was absurd. The light for the 32nd floor was brightly lit, the only one selected. Aaliyah's gaze flickered from the illuminated button to his face. It was a test, a deliberate challenge disguised as a neutral inquiry. She had played this game before. Her response was calm, her tone measured, betraying none of the irritation bubbling within her. 32, as indicated. She gestured slightly with her chin toward the panel. Miller exchanged a look with his partner, Russo. It was a quick, conspiratorial glance that spoke volumes. It said, "See? Just like we thought." Russo, the stockier one, shifted his weight, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered sidearm. It wasn't a threat, not overtly, but it was a reminder of the power they wielded, a piece of the uniform meant to intimidate. "What's on the 32nd floor?" Russo asked, his voice a low rumble. This was not a question of curiosity. It was an accusation. "My home," Aaliyah replied, her patience wearing thin. She could feel her jaw tightening. She forced it to relax. In her courtroom, she controlled the flow of information. She dictated the terms of every exchange. Here, in this tiny, moving room, she was stripped of her authority, reduced to a subject of suspicion. The irony was a bitter pill. She spent her days upholding the very laws these men were supposed to enforce, yet in their eyes, her presence was a crime to be investigated. Miller took a half-step forward, his pale eyes scanning her from head to toe. His gaze lingered on her designer handbag, then on the tasteful but expensive watch on her wrist, then on the fine fabric of her blazer. It was a predatory inventory, a cataloging of items he seemed to believe she had no right to possess. "We've had reports," he said, the lie sliding easily from his lips, "of suspicious individuals gaining access to the residential floors. People who don't belong here." The implication was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. "You don't belong here." It was a phrase she hadn't heard spoken aloud since she was a girl, but she had felt it in the wary glances of shopkeepers, the surprised expressions of colleagues, the condescending tones of opposing counsel. To hear it now, in the elevator of her own home, from the mouth of a sworn officer of the law, was a profound violation. The sanctuary had been breached. "And I fit that description?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. It was the same tone she used in court just before eviscerating a fallacious legal argument. It was a tone that warned of an imminent and devastating counterattack. But Miller was too arrogant, too insulated by his badge and his prejudices, to recognize the warning. "You tell us," he countered, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a nice building, expensive, a lot of people trying to get a piece of the action." The elevator chimed softly, announcing its arrival at the 15th floor. The doors remained closed. Aaliyah realized with a jolt of cold fear that one of them had pressed the emergency stop button. The gentle ascent had ceased. They were suspended between floors, trapped in a gilded cage with two men who saw her not as a resident, not as a citizen, not as a federal judge, but as a problem to be solved. The quiet hum of the machinery died, replaced by a profound humming silence. The air grew thick, heavy with menace. Her heart, which had been beating a steady, controlled rhythm, now began to hammer against her ribs. The day was bright and beautiful outside, but in the confines of the elevator a deep, suffocating shadow had fallen, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The pretense was over. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, targeted act of intimidation. The transition from the cool, controlled environment of the Sterling's lobby to the sun-baked pavement outside was jarring. It was as if Judge Aaliyah Vance had been physically ejected from her own life. The confrontation had spilled out of the elevator and onto the private driveway, a spectacle for the valets, the doormen, and the few residents coming and going. The initial shock had receded, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a public shaming, a deliberate spectacle of power. Officers Miller and Russo had escorted her out of the building as if she were a common criminal, their hands hovering near their sides, their bodies flanking her in a clear display of custody. The afternoon sun, which had seemed so benevolent just minutes before, now felt harsh and accusatory. It glinted off the chrome of her sedan, the car that now served as the centerpiece of their impromptu interrogation. Miller circled the vehicle slowly, running a gloved hand along the smooth, black paint. "This your car?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. "It is," Aaliyah stated, her voice tight. She stood with her feet planted firmly on the ground, her back straight. She refused to let them see her shrink. "Nice ride," Russo chimed in from her other side. "Must have cost a pretty penny. What kind of work you do to afford something like this? And a place in the Sterling?" The questions were a classic tactic of intimidation, designed to chip away at her legitimacy, to imply that her success must be ill-gotten. They were questioning her very existence in this world of affluence, a world they believed was reserved for people who looked like them. Every word was laced with the poison of racial prejudice and economic envy. Aaliyah had faced down seasoned prosecutors and defended her legal opinions before the most brilliant minds on the appellate court. Yet this crude, sidewalk interrogation felt more invasive, more personal. "I am a federal judge," she said, the words coming out with a steely precision. She had hoped the statement would be a bucket of cold water, a shock to their system that would end this charade. She expected a moment of realization, perhaps even a flash of fear in their eyes. She received none. Miller chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He stopped his circling and faced her, leaning back against the warm hood of her car. "A federal judge? That's a good one. You don't look like any judge I've ever seen." The insult was blatant, a direct assault on her identity, her career, her life's work. He wasn't just questioning her story, he was denying her reality. The color of her skin, in his mind, was a disqualification for the position she held. The injustice of it was staggering. She had sworn an oath to administer justice without respect to persons, to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. And now that oath, that sacred trust, was being mocked on the pavement in front of her home. "Let me see some identification," Russo demanded, stepping closer, "and your registration and insurance for the vehicle." "I am being detained?" Aaliyah asked, her voice sharp with legal clarity. "Am I free to go?" "You're free to go once you've satisfied our questions," Miller said smoothly, though the threat was clear. It was an illegal detention. They had no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause. They were operating on pure, unadulterated bias. This was the kind of police misconduct she read about in civil rights filings, the kind she presided over in her own courtroom. To be living it was surreal, a nightmare bleeding into the bright afternoon. She hesitated for a beat, weighing her options. Complying felt like a surrender, an admission that their suspicion was somehow valid. Resisting, however, could escalate the situation in unpredictable and dangerous ways. She had seen too many videos, read too many reports of how quickly these encounters could turn violent. With a deep, steadying breath, she reached for the handbag still slung over her shoulder. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She would not give them any excuse to claim she was making a sudden move. Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she unclasped the leather flap. The anger was a hot coil in her stomach, but her mind was a whirlwind of legal calculus, documenting every violation, every word, every gesture for a battle that she knew was to come. The sun beat down, the city hummed on around them, but for Aaliyah Vance, the world had shrunk to this small patch of pavement, a makeshift courtroom where she was the one on trial. The demand for identification was the tipping point. It was the moment the encounter transitioned from a hostile inquiry into an official, albeit unlawful, seizure. Judge Aaliyah Vance's training, her very instinct as a jurist, screamed at the flagrant violation of her Fourth Amendment rights. But the reality of the situation, the two armed men, their escalating aggression, the public setting, counseled a different course. A battle fought on this pavement would be lost before it began. The real fight would happen later, in an arena of her choosing. With deliberate, measured movements, she opened her black leather handbag. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a stark contrast to her outwardly calm demeanor. She was acutely aware of their eyes on her, watching her every move, searching for any sign of defiance. As she reached inside, her fingers brushed against the cool, worn leather of her wallet. But Miller, his patience apparently exhausted, took another step forward. "On second thought," he said, his voice hard, "I don't want you reaching into that bag. You could have a weapon. Put the bag on the hood of the car, slowly." The accusation was as absurd as it was insulting. A weapon? The only weapons she wielded were the Constitution and the federal code. The demand was a pure power play, designed to strip her of her final vestiges of dignity and control. Still, she complied. She placed the expensive handbag on the gleaming black hood of her car with a soft thud. The sound seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Now turn around," Miller commanded. "Hands on the wall." Aaliyah froze. The wall he was referring to was the rough, beige brick facade of the Sterling, her home. He was ordering her to assume the position of a criminal suspect against the wall of her own sanctuary. The humiliation of the command was a physical blow. It was a public branding, an attempt to mark her as an outsider, a trespasser. For a moment, pure, unadulterated rage threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to scream at them, to unleash the full force of her legal knowledge and righteous fury, to tell them exactly who she was and the catastrophic mistake they were making. But she held it back. The discipline of the bench, the years of maintaining composure while listening to the most harrowing testimonies, took over. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not give them the ammunition they needed to paint her as an uncooperative or resisting subject. Slowly, she turned. The rough texture of the brick was cool against her palms. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the familiar pattern of the mortar, a mundane detail in a world that had suddenly turned upside gaga. She could feel their presence behind her, could hear the rustle of their uniforms, the creak of their leather belts. She was exposed, vulnerable, her back turned to the threat. It was the most powerless she had felt in her adult life. "We're just going to check for weapons," Rousseau muttered, his voice close to her ear. She heard the snap of a latex glove. His hands were on her. The touch was impersonal, yet profoundly violating. He ran his hands down her arms, her sides, over the curve of her hips. It was a clumsy, unprofessional search, more an act of dominance than a genuine security measure. He was touching her blazer, the one she had picked out that morning, the one that made her feel confident and authoritative. Now it felt like a costume in a degrading play. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, fighting back a wave of nausea. Every second stretched into an eternity. The sounds of the city, A distant siren, the rumble of traffic, the laughter of people walking by seemed to come from another planet. Her world had been reduced to the rough texture of the brick against her palms, the feeling of a stranger's hands on her body, and the burning, suffocating shame of this public degradation. She was Judge Aaliyah Vance of the United States District Court, and she was being treated like a common thief on her own doorstep. The illegal search was a blur of calculated indignities. Russo's hands moved over her body, a clear and undeniable assault under the color of law. Judge Vance remained motionless, her palms flat against the brick, her mind a cold, precise instrument recording every detail. This was no longer just an incident, it was evidence. While Russo conducted the pat-down, Miller turned his attention to her handbag on the hood of the car. He upended it without ceremony, dumping its contents onto the gleaming black paint. Her life spilled out in a chaotic jumble. A leather-bound journal, a silver pen, a tube of red lipstick, her car keys, a small bottle of hand sanitizer, and her wallet. Miller picked up the wallet, a slim, elegant accessory that matched her bag. He flipped it open with a proprietary air, his thumb swiping past her credit cards and her driver's license. He was looking for confirmation of his prejudice, proof that she was a fraud. And then he found something else. It was in a separate, clear sleeve tucked behind her license. A card, heavier than the others, with a gold-embossed seal. From her position against the wall, Aaliyah couldn't see it, but she knew exactly what it was. Her federal judicial identification. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if the sound of the entire city had been cut off. The ambient noise, the distant traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, it all vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Aaliyah heard Miller's breath catch in his throat. It was a small, sharp, involuntary sound of shock. "Russo," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "Look at this." The hands on her body disappeared. She heard Russo's footsteps as he moved to the front of the car. She remained perfectly still, her hands against the wall, listening. The silence stretched, taut and humming with a new kind of tension. It was no longer the tension of a predator cornering its prey. It was the tension of a hunter realizing he has accidentally cornered a lion. "No way," Russo breathed. "It's a fake. It has to be a fake." "I don't know, man." Miller's voice was strained, the earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a high-pitched note of panic. "The seal! It looks real!" Slowly, deliberately, Aaliyah pushed herself off the wall. She turned around. The two officers were huddled over her wallet, their faces pale under the afternoon sun. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a rapidly dawning, sickening horror. They looked up at her as she approached, their eyes wide. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. She stood before them, her blazer slightly rumpled, her dignity bruised but intact. She looked at the scattered contents of her purse, then at the identification card in Miller's trembling hand. The card featured her photograph, her name, the Honorable Aaliyah N. Vance, and her title, United States District Judge. Below that, the golden eagle seal of the United States federal judiciary seemed to glitter in the sunlight, a silent, powerful rebuke. The air was frozen. The valet stood motionless by the curb, his mouth slightly agape. The doorman had frozen mid-stride. They had all been witnesses to the harassment, and now they were witnesses to this stunning, cinematic reveal. Miller continued to stare at the card, then at her face, then back at the card. The gears were turning in his head, processing the catastrophic scale of the mistake he had just made. He had not just harassed a citizen. He had not just illegally detained a resident. He had assaulted, searched, and humiliated a sitting federal judge. In the rigid hierarchy of the American legal system, he was a foot soldier who had just spat in the face of a general. The silence was finally broken by Miller, his voice barely audible. What is this?" he stammered, holding up the card as if it were a venomous snake. Aaliyah met his terrified gaze with an expression as cold and hard as granite. "That," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that had been forged in the crucible of 1,000 court battles. "Is your career ending?" The moment hung in the air, thick with the weight of their catastrophic miscalculation. The federal ID in Officer Miller's hand might as well have been a live grenade. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant certainty, had crumbled into a mess of panic and confusion. Officer Russo stood beside him, looking from the ID to Judge Vance and back again, his ruddy complexion now a pasty, sickly white. The foundation of their worldview, a world where a black woman couldn't possibly possess this kind of power, was shattering before their eyes. For a rational person, this would have been the moment for a swift, profuse, and desperate apology. It was the moment to de-escalate, to backpedal, to throw oneself at the mercy of the person they had so grievously wronged. But Miller and Russo were not rational. They were cornered, and like cornered animals, they chose to lash out rather than retreat. The instinct for self-preservation, twisted by years of unchecked bias and a belief in their own impunity, led them to make a second, far more destructive decision. They decided to double down on the lie. "This is fake," Miller declared, his voice regaining a sliver of its earlier bravado, though it was thin and brittle now. He held the ID out as if presenting evidence. "A damn good fake, I'll give you that. Where did you get it?" Russo, seeing his partner's play, quickly fell into line. It was a desperate gambit, a shared delusion born of sheer terror. "Yeah," he added, his voice a little too loud, "impersonating a federal officer, that's a serious crime, a very serious crime." Judge Vance watched them, a feeling of profound, weary disbelief washing over her. The absurdity was breathtaking. They would rather believe in an elaborate criminal conspiracy, that a woman had somehow procured a high-quality forged federal judicial ID, bought a luxury car, and secured a residence in one of the city's most exclusive buildings, all as part of some nefarious plot, than accept the simple, glaring truth. They had racially profiled the wrong person. Their prejudice was so deeply ingrained that it was literally overriding the evidence of their own senses. "You are accusing me of impersonating a federal judge?" Aaliyah asked, her voice dangerously calm. She wanted them to hear the words, to understand the legal precipice they were now standing on. She was giving them one last chance to turn back. "We are," Miller confirmed, his confidence growing as he committed more fully to the fabrication. "We're going to have to take you in. We'll get this all sorted out down at the precinct." He was creating a narrative, a smokescreen of official procedure to cover his tracks. He was trying to transform himself from the perpetrator into the hero who uncovered a clever fraud. It was a pathetic, transparent, and utterly doomed strategy. He reached for his radio, his hand shaking slightly. "Dispatch, this is Unit 74, he said, his voice straining to sound professional. "We have a situation at the Sterling, 1400 Grand Avenue. We have detained a female suspect for suspected impersonation of a federal official, requesting backup and a transport vehicle." The radio call was a point of no return. It was an official declaration of their lie, now broadcast over a recorded channel. Aaliyah knew, with the certainty of a seasoned lawyer, that every word he just spoke would be Exhibit A in the federal case against him. She watched him, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached, clinical pity. He had no idea what he had just done. He had no concept of the institutional fury he was about to unleash upon himself. He thought he was controlling the situation, but he had just signed his own professional death warrant. Russo, emboldened by the radio call, took out his handcuffs. "Ma'am, you need to put your hands behind your back," he said, stepping toward her. The afternoon sun glinted off the steel cuffs. The scene had escalated from harassment to a full-blown, wrongful arrest. This was it. The final, irrevocable line had been crossed. The lie, born of pure panic and prejudice, had now taken on a life of its own, and it was dragging them all into a legal abyss from which there would be no escape. Just as Officer Russo took a step forward, the steel of his handcuffs catching the light, something inside Judge Aaliyah Vance shifted. The victim receded, and the judge emerged. The sidewalk was no longer a scene of her humiliation. It became her courtroom. Her fear and anger were transmuted into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She raised a hand, not in a gesture of surrender, but of command. It was the same gesture she used to silence a disruptive attorney, a gesture that radiated an authority so absolute it was palpable. "Stop," she said. The single word, spoken without volume but with the full weight of the federal judiciary behind it, froze Russo in his tracks. He stopped, the handcuffs dangling from his fingers, a look of confusion on his face. Both officers stared at her, momentarily stunned by the sheer force of her presence. "Before you compound your series of felonies with another," she began, her voice crisp and articulate, "let's review the law, shall we?" She took a step toward them, closing the distance they had created. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, pinned first Miller, then Russo. "At approximately 2:15 this afternoon, you detained me without reasonable suspicion, a clear violation of my Fourth Amendment rights as established in Terry v. Ohio. You then escalated that illegal detention by using an emergency stop in the elevator, constituting false imprisonment." She gestured toward the brick wall. "You then conducted a non-consensual search of my person and property without probable cause, a further violation of the Fourth Amendment. Now, you are attempting a wrongful arrest based on a fabrication you concocted because you are incapable of believing that a woman who looks like me could hold my position. That charge, impersonation of a federal official, will collapse under the barest scrutiny, at which point your actions will be reclassified as what they are: deprivation of rights under color of law, Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code." She let the legal citations hang in the air, each one a hammer blow against their flimsy defense. She wasn't just talking to them, she was dictating the opening statement for their prosecution. Miller's face had gone from pale to ashen. Russo looked utterly lost, his eyes darting between his partner and the woman who was now systematically dismantling their reality. "Furthermore," she continued, her tone becoming even colder, "every second of this encounter, from the moment you entered the elevator, has been recorded. The elevator has high-definition video. The building's exterior is covered by security cameras, including the one—" She pointed a perfectly steady finger at a small dome camera above the driveway. "Right there. Your own department's policy dictates that your body cameras should be active, recording every word of your transparently false narrative. And finally—" She paused for effect, letting the weight of her next words settle. "I can assure you that the United States Marshals Service, the FBI, and the Office of the U.S. Attorney for this district take an extremely dim view of local police officers harassing, assaulting, and arresting a member of the federal judiciary." She had laid it all out: the facts, the law, the consequences. There was no bluster, no emotion, just the cold, hard, irrefutable truth. The arrogance had completely evaporated from the two officers. In its place was the raw, primal terror of men who have just realized they have blundered into a minefield and are hearing the click under their feet. It was at that precise moment that a black and white squad car, a supervisor's vehicle, pulled into the driveway, its arrival quiet and professional, without sirens. The door opened, and a woman in a captain's uniform stepped out. She was in her late 40s, with sharp features, hair pulled back in a tight bun, and an air of weary competence. Her eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Two of her officers looking terrified, a woman in a business suit standing with formidable composure, and the contents of a purse scattered across the hood of an expensive car. Her expression hardened. This was not a routine call. This was a mess. Captain Ava Rostova had been a police officer for 25 years. She had started as a patrolwoman on the midnight shift and worked her way up through detective squads and internal affairs to her current position as a precinct captain. In that time, she had developed what she called a finely tuned bullshit detector, an almost sixth sense for when a situation was spiraling out of control, usually because one of her officers had done something monumentally stupid. As she stepped out of her cruiser and into the bright afternoon sun at the Sterling, her detector wasn't just going off. It was screaming. The scene was all wrong. Miller and Russo, two officers she knew to be cocky and prone to complaints, looked like they'd seen a ghost. The woman they were confronting stood with an unnatural stillness, a posture that wasn't defiant or scared, but powerfully, unnervingly composed. And the contents of a woman's handbag strewn across the hood of a car was never, ever a sign of good police work. It was a sign of contempt. "Miller, Russo," Rostova said, her voice a low, commanding growl that cut through the tension. "Report, now! What is going on here?" Miller, startled by the captain's sudden appearance, scrambled to regain his composure. He was desperate to control the narrative, to get his version of the story to her first. "Captain," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "we responded to a report of a suspicious person trying to gain access to the building. This individual," he gestured vaguely toward Judge Vance, "was unable to verify her residency and became belligerent. When we asked for ID, she produced this." He held out the federal judicial ID as if it were a smoking gun. "We believe it's a forgery. We were in the process of taking her into custody for impersonating a federal official." Rostova took the ID from Miller's hand. She didn't glance at it immediately. Her eyes were fixed on Judge Vance, taking in the expensive but conservative suit, the intelligent and unflinching gaze, the complete absence of fear. This woman did not look like a con artist. She looked like she owned the entire block. Rostova's instincts were telling her that Miller's story was a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies. "She became belligerent?" Rostova repeated, her gaze shifting to Miller. "Define belligerent." "She was uncooperative," Russo chimed in, eager to back up his partner. "Refused to answer our questions. Gave us attitude." "I see," Rostova said, her tone icy. She finally looked down at the ID in her hand. She read the name, the Honorable Aaliyah N. Vance. She saw the title, United States District Judge. She studied the photograph, a professional headshot of the composed, formidable woman standing right in front of her. Rostova had been in the city's justice system for a long time. She knew the names of the federal judges, and she knew the name Vance. She had even testified in her courtroom once, years ago, as a detective. A cold dread, the kind a commander feels when they know they are about to face an institutional catastrophe, washed over her. Her officers hadn't just made a mistake. They had committed an act of career and possibly departmental suicide. She looked up from the ID, her sharp eyes meeting Judge Vance's. There was a moment of silent communication between the two women of authority. In that glance, Rostova saw the truth of the situation as clearly as if she had watched it on a monitor. She saw the profiling, the harassment, the abuse of power. "Did you run her name?" Rostova asked, her voice dangerously quiet, her eyes never leaving Miller's. Miller swallowed hard. "We were about to, Captain. We wanted to secure the suspect first." It was another lie, and Rostova knew it. It was the last, desperate lie of a man drowning in his own misconduct. She turned her back on her officers, a clear gesture of dismissal, and faced Judge Vance directly. The air of confrontation was gone, replaced by one of grave, professional courtesy. "Judge Vance," she said, the title falling from her lips with the weight of absolute certainty. "My name is Captain Rostova. On behalf of the department, I am so sorry. There appears to have been a terrible misunderstanding." The apology, though necessary, felt woefully inadequate. It was like using a teacup to bail out a sinking battleship. Judge Aaliyah Vance listened to Captain Rostova's apology, her expression unreadable. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Captain, it's good that you're here, but this was not a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is a misplaced coffee order. This was a deliberate and illegal series of actions." Rostova didn't flinch. She had anticipated this. "I understand, Your Honor, and I assure you it will be dealt with, severely." She turned back to her officers, her face a mask of cold fury. The brief moment of professional courtesy was over. Now came the reckoning. Miller, Rostova's voice was like ice. You said you responded to a report. From whom? A 911 call? Building security? Miller hesitated. The foundation of his lie was now being systematically dismantled by his own commanding officer. It came from building security, Captain. A verbal report to us when we were passing by. Rostova's eyes narrowed. So there's no radio log of this initial complaint? No call record? No, Captain, he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the pavement. Rostova turned to the doorman, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide-eyed horror. You! She called out, her voice sharp. You're the doorman on duty? The man, whose name tag read Frank, nodded nervously. Did you or anyone on your staff report a suspicious person to these officers? Frank shook his head vigorously. No, Captain, absolutely not. Judge Vance lives here. We all know her. There was no report. The officers just started questioning her when she tried to get on the elevator. The lie had been exposed. It was a clean, fatal blow. Miller's face, if possible, grew even paler. He looked trapped, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Russo looked like he was about to be physically ill. I see, Rostova said, her voice dripping with contempt. She turned back to Miller. So, you lied. You fabricated a complaint to justify harassing a resident who happens to be a federal judge. Before Miller could stammer out another pathetic excuse, Aaliyah spoke again, her voice cutting through the air. Captain, I believe you will find the building's security footage to be most illuminating. As I already informed your officers, the entire encounter in the elevator and out here has been recorded from multiple angles. The mention of security footage was the final nail in their coffin. Video evidence was impartial. It couldn't be intimidated or misled. It would show their aggression, their lies, their illegal search, and their ultimate panicked decision to arrest her. There would be no room for ambiguity, no he said, she said. There would only be the cold, hard, visual truth. Rostova nodded grimly. She had already assumed as much. A building like the Sterling would have better surveillance than a casino. She pulled out her police-issued smartphone and began to type, her thumbs moving with swift efficiency. What are you doing, Captain? Russo asked, his voice shaking. I'm emailing the U.S. Attorney's Office, Rostova replied without looking up. I'm giving them a professional courtesy heads-up that 2 of my officers have just illegally detained and assaulted a member of the federal judiciary. Then, I'm calling the chief of police to inform him that his department is about to be at the center of a major federal investigation. And then, she finally looked up, her gaze landing on them like a physical weight, I am going to relieve both of you of your weapons and your badges, right here, right now. The words hung in the air, a formal declaration of their utter and complete ruin. Their fabricated story, built on a foundation of racial arrogance, had been exposed and had crumbled into dust in less than 5 minutes under the barest scrutiny. The unraveling was complete. All that was left was the fallout, and Rostova knew it was going to be immense. The moment Captain Rostova pronounced their fate, the world seemed to tilt on its axis for Officers Miller and Rousseau. The authority they had wielded with such casual cruelty just moments before was stripped from them in a single, brutal sentence. The driveway of the Sterling, which they had commandeered as their personal fiefdom, was now the stage for their public disgrace. Unbuckle your belts, Rostova commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Place them on the hood of the car, now! The order was profoundly symbolic. A police officer's duty belt, weighing upwards of 20 pounds with its firearm, taser, cuffs, radio, and magazines, was the source of their power, the tangible manifestation of their authority. To be disarmed in the field, in public, was the ultimate humiliation, a visible declaration that they were no longer trusted to uphold the law. Miller moved like a man in a trance, his hands fumbling with the complex buckle of his belt. His movements were clumsy, robbed of their earlier swagger. Russo followed suit, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the ground. The heavy belts were placed on the hood of Judge Vance's car with a series of loud, metallic clunks, landing right next to the scattered contents of her handbag. The juxtaposition was stark, the instruments of their abusive power lying next to the personal effects of the woman they had victimized. "Your badges," Rostova said, her hand outstretched. They unpinned the silver shields from their chests. The badges, which had once seemed to gleam with authority, now looked like cheap pieces of tin in their trembling hands. They placed them in Rostova's palm. She closed her fingers around them, the metal cool against her skin. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Residents peered from the lobby windows, and passers-by on the street had slowed their pace, drawn by the drama. They were witnessing a scene of almost poetic justice. The two men who had tried to wrongfully arrest an innocent woman were now being publicly stripped of their power by their own superior. Rostova spoke into her radio, her voice formal and clear. "Dispatch, send an additional unit to my location. I have 2 officers I am placing on administrative leave pending a federal investigation. They are to be escorted back to the precinct and confined to the briefing room until Internal Affairs arrives." She paused, then added, "And notify the FBI liaison. Tell them it's urgent." Having delivered her orders, she turned to her disgraced officers. "You are not to speak to anyone about this incident. You are not to contact each other. You will surrender your department-issued phones. You will wait here until your escort arrives. Is that understood?" They both mumbled a defeated, "Yes, Captain." They stood there, disarmed and diminished, their crisp uniforms suddenly looking like ill-fitting costumes. The power had been completely and irrevocably transferred. Judge Vance had watched the entire proceeding with a quiet, solemn dignity. She felt no triumph, no glee, only a profound and weary sadness. This was a failure of the system she had sworn to serve, a system that had allowed men like this to carry a badge and a gun. She stepped forward and began to quietly gather her belongings from the hood of her car, placing her wallet, her pen, and her lipstick back into her handbag with steady hands. Rostova approached her, her expression one of deep professional regret. "Judge Vance," she said softly, "federal investigators are going to want to speak with you. They will handle this from here on out. My department will cooperate fully, but this is now a federal matter." "I understand, Captain," Aaliyah replied, closing her handbag with a soft click. "Thank you for your professionalism." The compliment was genuine. Rostova had acted with the integrity and decisiveness that Miller and Russo so utterly lacked. She had been a beacon of reason in a storm of prejudice. As the second squad car pulled into the driveway to collect the 2 disgraced officers, the turning of the tables was complete. Miller and Russo, who had arrived as predators, would now leave as pariahs, their careers in ruins. Judge Aaliyah Vance, whom they had treated as a suspect, stood as the unassailable victor, a symbol of a justice that, while sometimes delayed, would not be denied. The arrival of the second squad car marked the end of the initial confrontation and the beginning of a much larger, more complex storm. Officers Miller and Russo were quietly escorted into the back of the vehicle, their faces blank with shock. They didn't look at Judge Vance. They didn't look at Captain Rostova. They stared straight ahead, their gazes fixed on the wreckage of their own lives. As the car pulled away, a funereal silence fell over the driveway, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. Within the hour, the sleek, dark sedans began to arrive. These were not police cars. They belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Men and women in sharp, conservative suits emerged, their demeanor calm, serious, and efficient. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who were accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. The senior agent, a tall, graying man named Harris, introduced himself to Judge Vance and Captain Rostova with grave formality. "Judge Vance," Harris said, his voice a low baritone. "We came as soon as we heard. Are you all right?" "I am unharmed, Agent Harris," she replied, her voice steady. "But I have been illegally detained, searched, and was about to be wrongfully arrested by 2 of this city's police officers." Harris nodded slowly, his eyes dark with concern. "We will be taking full jurisdiction over this investigation, Captain," he said, turning to Rostova. We'll need all body camera footage, radio logs, and preliminary reports from your officers. We will also be securing the building's surveillance footage immediately." "Of course," Rostova agreed without hesitation. "You'll have our full cooperation." While the federal agents began their work, interviewing the doorman, securing the video feeds, cordoning off the driveway as if it were a crime scene, Aaliyah felt a profound sense of detachment. She was now a witness, a victim in a federal case. The system she commanded from the bench had now enveloped her. She gave a concise, detailed statement to Agent Harris, recounting the events with the clarity and precision of a legal brief. She omitted no detail, from the officers' initial suspicious glances to their final panicked lie. As she spoke, the first news van arrived, then another, and another. Someone from inside the federal courthouse or the police department had leaked the story. The "what?" a federal judge being harassed by local cops was too sensational to contain. The media descended like vultures, cameras and microphones at the ready. Reporters began broadcasting live from the curb, their faces serious as they described the unfolding situation at one of the city's most exclusive addresses. The story was a perfect storm: race, power, police misconduct, and a high-profile victim. It was guaranteed to lead every newscast that evening. Judge Vance looked at the burgeoning media circus with deep distaste. She had spent her career avoiding the spotlight, believing that judges should be known for their written opinions, not their public personas. She had no interest in trying this case in the court of public opinion. "Your Honor, we can give you a security escort home," Agent Harris offered, noticing her discomfort. "Or to a secure location if you prefer." "Thank you, Agent," she said, "but I am going home, to my apartment." It was a small but important act of defiance. She would not be driven from her sanctuary. Flanked by 2 FBI agents, she walked past the throng of reporters, ignoring their shouted questions. She entered the lobby of the Sterling, her head held high, and finally, blessedly, stepped into the elevator, alone this time. As the doors closed and she began her ascent, the silence was a balm. But she knew the peace would be temporary. The story was out. The firestorm had just begun. Her private life was over, at least for now. She had become a public symbol, and the weight of that new role felt heavier than any briefcase she had ever carried. The moment the FBI officially took over the investigation, the case of Judge Aaliyah Vance versus Officers Miller and Russo ceased to be a local police matter and became a federal priority. This was not merely an investigation into 2 rogue cops. It was an inquiry into an attack on the integrity of the entire federal judicial system. When a citizen is harassed, it's a crime. When a federal judge is harassed, it's a threat to the constitutional separation of powers. The full, formidable weight of the United States Department of Justice began to descend on the city's police department. Agent Harris and his team worked with terrifying efficiency. Within hours, they had obtained pristine, high-definition copies of all the relevant video footage. First, there was the footage from the elevator camera inside the Sterling. It was crystal clear, capturing every nuance of the initial encounter. It showed Miller and Russo's aggressive posture, Judge Vance's calm but wary demeanor, and the moment one of them deliberately pressed the emergency stop button, trapping her between floors. The audio, crisp and clean, recorded their loaded questions and her patient, measured responses. Next came the footage from the multiple cameras covering the building's exterior. One angle perfectly framed the entire sidewalk confrontation. It showed the illegal search, the humiliating moment she was forced to place her hands on the wall, and the casual, contemptuous way Miller dumped the contents of her handbag. A high-angle camera captured the stunning shift in the officer's body language when they saw her judicial ID, the sudden stillness, the panicked huddling, the visible shock. Finally, and perhaps most damningly, there was the body camera footage from Miller and Russo themselves. As Judge Vance had predicted, the cameras had been running. The footage was a first-person view of their own crimes. It captured their whispered, conspiratorial asides in the elevator. It recorded with perfect clarity their decision to lie about the ID being a fake and their radio call to dispatch requesting backup for a fraudulent charge. The video showed not a moment of hesitation or remorse, only a panicked, self-serving attempt to construct a false narrative. Encountered together, the recordings formed a seamless, undeniable, and utterly devastating chronicle of abuse of power. There were no gaps, no ambiguities, no moments left to interpretation. Agent Harris and the federal prosecutors assigned to the case watched the compiled footage in a silent, darkened room at the FBI field office. When the playback finished, a grim silence hung in the air. "I've been doing this for 30 years, a senior prosecutor finally said, rubbing his eyes. "I've seen bad searches, coerced confessions, outright brutality. I have never seen a case this clean. They documented their own felonies from start to finish." The evidence was so overwhelming that it shifted the focus of the investigation. The guilt of Miller and Russo was a foregone conclusion. The new, more pressing question was this an isolated incident, or was it a symptom of a deeper sickness within their precinct? Men like Miller and Russo didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were trained, supervised, and, all too often, enabled by the culture around them. The federal gaze, having dispensed with the two disgraced officers, now turned inward, focusing a powerful and unwelcome spotlight on their entire unit. The FBI began pulling their complaint histories, their arrest records, their use of force reports. They started looking for patterns, for other victims who may not have had the power or the platform of a federal judge to fight back. The case was no longer just about Judge Vance. It was about every person of color who had ever been unjustly stopped, questioned, or harassed by officers from that precinct. The storm that had started in a luxury elevator was about to become a hurricane, and it was heading straight for the heart of the city's police department. The federal investigation into the 12th Precinct, home unit of former officers Miller and Russo, began not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a rising tide. Subpoenas were issued. Personnel files were seized. Internal affairs records, which had been jealously guarded by the department, were now in the hands of FBI analysts. The Department of Justice announced it was opening a pattern or practice investigation, a sweeping civil rights probe designed to root out systemic misconduct rather than just punish individual officers. For the command staff and officers of the 12th, it was a waking nightmare. They were officially under a federal microscope. Agent Harris's team of investigators descended on the precinct, setting up a temporary command post in a vacant office. They were polite, professional, and implacable. They began interviewing officers, supervisors, and civilian staff one by one. The interviews were grueling, with FBI agents and DOJ lawyers cross-referencing every statement against official records and the damning footage from the Judge Vance incident. A culture of fear and paranoia began to fester within the precinct walls. The blue wall of silence, the unwritten code that protected officers from outside scrutiny, began to crack under the immense federal pressure. The data analysts found the patterns quickly. Miller and Russo were not outliers. They were an extreme manifestation of a pervasive culture. The precinct's stop and frisk numbers were wildly disproportionate, with black and brown citizens being stopped at a rate 10 times that of their white counterparts, despite contraband being found at a higher rate on white subjects. Citizen complaints for verbal abuse and excessive force, particularly from Miller and Russo's shift, were routinely dismissed by their direct supervisor with little to no investigation. The body camera audits were a joke. Officers frequently failed to activate their cameras during confrontational encounters, and when they did, the footage often mysteriously malfunctioned or was lost. The case of Judge Vance had opened the floodgates. Seeing that the system was finally being forced to hold itself accountable, other victims began to come forward. A young lawyer who had been illegally searched after being pulled over for a broken taillight that worked perfectly fine. A college professor who was berated and threatened for filming officers arresting a teenager in his neighborhood. a small business owner who was repeatedly ticketed and harassed under the guise of code enforcement. Their stories, previously dismissed or ignored, now became crucial pieces of a much larger mosaic of abuse. The investigation uncovered a sick competition among a clique of younger officers, including Miller and Russo, to see who could get the most high-profile arrests in affluent neighborhoods, specifically targeting people of color they deemed out of place. They had a name for it: punching up. They saw it as a game, a way to exert their authority in places where they themselves felt like outsiders. Their harassment of Judge Vance wasn't just a random act of prejudice. It was the catastrophic conclusion of their twisted sport. Captain Rostova, from her command post at a different precinct, was brought in by the FBI as a cooperating witness. She provided crucial insight into the departmental politics and the failures of leadership at the 12th that allowed such a toxic culture to flourish. Her testimony painted a picture of a precinct commander who was more concerned with arrest statistics than constitutional policing, and a sergeants' union that aggressively defended even the most problematic officers from any form of discipline. The media followed every development, with daily headlines exposing the rot within the 12th precinct. Public trust in the police department plummeted. The city council held emergency hearings. The mayor, facing a full-blown crisis, was forced to publicly demand the resignation of the chief of police. The actions of two officers on one sunny afternoon had triggered a systemic earthquake, and the entire edifice of the city's law enforcement was beginning to shake. The precinct that had created Miller and Russo was now being unmade by them. 6 months after the incident, the federal trial of James Miller and Kevin Russo began. The case had been fast-tracked, a clear signal from the Department of Justice that this was a matter of utmost national importance. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with journalists, legal scholars, police reform advocates, and members of the public, all drawn to witness the culmination of a story that had captivated the nation. At the prosecution's table sat the lead attorney from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, a sharp, formidable woman named Elena Morales. At the defense table, Miller and Russo sat stiffly in ill-fitting suits, their faces pale and drawn. They looked less like police officers and more like defendants, which, of course, they now were. Their defense was as desperate as it was predictable. Their lawyers argued that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity fueled by legitimate concerns about security in the area. They tried to paint Judge Vance as arrogant and uncooperative, suggesting that her attitude had escalated the situation. They claimed the officers, faced with a suspicious and non-compliant individual, had simply followed their training. It was a flimsy narrative, and Morales was about to tear it to shreds. The prosecution's case was a masterclass in methodical demolition. They didn't even call Judge Vance to the stand on the first day. Instead, they started with the evidence. They played the videos, all of them. On a massive screen that dominated the courtroom, the jury watched the entire incident unfold in excruciating detail. They saw the elevator confrontation, the illegal search, the moment the judicial ID was revealed, and the officer's panicked, foolish decision to invent the impersonation charge. They heard the audio from the body cameras, the condescending questions, the transparent lies. The video evidence was so powerful, so irrefutable, that it rendered most of the defense's arguments obsolete before they were even made. Morales would play a clip, Miller sneering, "You don't look like any judge I've ever seen," and then pause. She would let the raw, undisguised bigotry of the statement hang in the silent courtroom. Then she would turn to the jury and simply say, "They're training." The effect was devastating. Witness after witness took the stand. The doorman, Frank, testified that there had been no security report and that Judge Vance was a respected, well-known resident. Captain Rostova testified about the officers' lies and their complete lack of a legitimate basis for the stop. An FBI expert testified to the authenticity of Judge Vance's credentials, dismantling the forgery claim. Finally, on the third day, Judge Aaliyah Vance took the stand. She walked to the witness box with the same calm dignity she brought to her own bench. She wore a simple navy blue suit, her expression composed and serious. She was not there as a judge. She was there as a citizen, a victim. Morales led her through the events of that afternoon, and Aaliyah recounted them in a clear, unwavering voice. She described not just what happened, but how it felt, the humiliation, the fear, the profound sense of violation. The defense attorney's cross-examination was a disaster. He tried to trip her up, to get her to admit she had been somehow responsible for the officer's reaction. "Judge Vance," he began, "would you agree that your initial responses to the officers were somewhat terse?" "I would agree that my responses were direct and factual," she replied calmly, "as is my right as a citizen who has not committed a crime." "But couldn't your directness have been misinterpreted as hostility?" he pressed. Aaliyah looked directly at the jury. "My directness was a response to being illegally detained and questioned in my own home. Is the price of a black woman's safety in this country an endless, smiling deference to baseless suspicion? I think not." The answer silenced the defense attorney. He had no more questions. The trial lasted less than a week. The jury, composed of a diverse cross-section of the city, deliberated for just 2 hours. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, handed the verdict to the clerk. The courtroom was deathly quiet as the clerk read the words, "On the charge of conspiracy against rights, we, the jury, find the defendant, James Miller, guilty. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant, James Miller, guilty." The same verdict was read for Russo, guilty, on all counts. A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. Miller stared blankly ahead while Russo finally broke, burying his face in his hands. The people had spoken. Now all that remained was the sentence. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. The atmosphere in the courtroom was even more charged than it had been during the trial. The verdict had affirmed the facts. The sentence would define the meaning of those facts. It would be the official statement from the justice system on the severity of Miller and Russo's crimes. The presiding judge was a man named Arthur McKinley, a senior judge known for his sharp intellect and his even sharper tongue. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, with little tolerance for misconduct from anyone in the legal profession, especially law enforcement. Miller and Russo stood before him, their lawyers on either side. They had traded their trial suits for standard-issue orange jumpsuits, their status as convicted felons now visually confirmed. They both made brief, halting statements, apologizing to the court, to the city, and to Judge Vance. Their apologies were filled with excuses, stress, poor training, a misreading of the situation. They sounded hollow, the self-serving pleas of men who were sorry not for what they had done, but for the fact that they had been caught. Then, Prosecutor Elena Morales rose to speak for the government. Her voice was filled with a cold, righteous anger. "Your Honor," she began, "this was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a conscious, deliberate, and malicious abuse of the most sacred trust we place in law enforcement. Mr. Miller and Mr. Russo did not just violate the rights of one citizen, they attacked the very foundation of the principle of equal justice under the law. They used the badge and the gun provided to them by the people as instruments of their own personal prejudice." She argued for the maximum sentence. "The message must be unequivocal," she concluded. "There can be no place in American law enforcement for this kind of behavior. The price for such a betrayal of public trust must be high. It must be severe. It must be a deterrent to any other officer who believes their badge places them above the Constitution." Finally, Judge McKinley cleared his throat and looked down from the bench. The room fell silent. He looked directly at Miller and Russo, his gaze so intense it seemed to pin them to the floor. "I have listened to your apologies," he began, his voice a low, powerful rumble, "and I find them to be utterly unconvincing. You speak of misunderstanding the situation, but the evidence shows you understood the situation perfectly. You saw a black woman in a place you believed she didn't belong, and you decided to teach her a lesson. The only thing you misunderstood was who you were dealing with. He paused, letting the words sink in. You took an oath to protect and serve, an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. You did not just break that oath, you shattered it. You used your authority not to protect a citizen, but to humiliate and terrorize one. And in doing so, you have brought shame upon yourselves, your department, and your profession. He picked up a sheaf of papers. The damage you have caused is immense. You have further eroded the fragile trust between law enforcement and the communities they are sworn to serve. You have become poster children for the very worst stereotypes of policing. Your actions have necessitated a full-scale federal overhaul of your precinct, an intervention required to clean up the toxic culture you so clearly embodied. He put the papers down and leaned forward, his eyes burning with cold fire. The law does not offer a different standard of justice for police officers. If anything, it demands a higher one. Because when you violate the law, you violate the trust of the entire society. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you have earned the most severe consequences. For the crime of conspiracy against rights and deprivation of rights under color of law, he declared, his voice booming through the silent courtroom, I sentence each of you to a term of 10 years in federal prison. A wave of shock and emotion swept through the room. 10 years. It was a sentence of stunning severity, a clear and unambiguous statement. Miller swayed on his feet as if he'd been physically struck. Russo sobbed openly. U.S. Marshals stepped forward and placed them in handcuffs. As they were led away, the sound of the courtroom door closing behind them was as final and absolute as the fall of a guillotine. The gavel of judgment had fallen, not with a tap, but with the force of a thunderclap. Months after the sentencing, the media storm had moved on to other stories, and the federal investigation into the 12th Precinct had transitioned into a long, bureaucratic process of reform. For Judge Aaliyah Vance, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. She returned to her chambers, to her docket, to the familiar, ordered world of law and precedent. She once again donned her black judicial robe, the simple garment that symbolized not power, but responsibility. Yet something within her had fundamentally changed. The robe felt different. It felt heavier, its purpose more profound, more personal. Her experience had not broken her, it had forged her. The abstract principles of constitutional law she had spent her life studying and applying were now etched into her soul. She had always been a fair and impartial judge, but now a new fire burned within her. It was a resolve, sharp and clear, to be not just a referee in the legal arena, but a vigilant guardian against the kind of injustice she had personally endured. When she looked out from the bench, she saw the faces before her with a new clarity. She saw the vulnerability of the accused, the power imbalance inherent in every courtroom, and the ever-present potential for the system to be warped by the biases of its human operators. She found herself paying closer attention during suppression hearings, questioning police testimony with a more incisive skepticism. She scrutinized requests for search warrants with a renewed focus on the letter of the Fourth Amendment. She became a powerful voice within the judiciary for improved training on racial bias and constitutional policing. Her colleagues, who had rallied around her in support, now listened with a new level of respect. She was no longer just an expert on the law. She was a living testament to its importance. One afternoon, she stood in her chambers, looking out the large window at the city skyline. The Sterling was visible in the distance, a thin, dark line against the sky. It was still her home, her sanctuary, but she no longer saw it as an impenetrable fortress. She knew that true sanctuary wasn't made of glass and steel, but of laws and rights, and the collective will to defend them. The incident had stripped away her illusions, but it had replaced them with a steely, unshakable purpose. She was part of a long line of fighters, of jurists and advocates who had dedicated their lives to bending the arc of the moral universe toward justice. Her ordeal had been her baptism by fire, a painful but powerful reminder of what was at stake. She turned from the window as her clerk buzzed to announce that the jury had reached a verdict in a complex fraud case she was presiding over. It was time to return to the bench. As she walked down the quiet, wood-paneled hallway toward the courtroom, she adjusted the robe on her shoulders. It settled into place, a familiar weight. She was Judge Aaliyah Vance. She had survived the fire, and she had returned to her bench, not weakened, but with a resolve of tempered steel, ready to wield her gavel not as a symbol of power, but as a tool of justice, a justice that had to be fought for, protected, and guaranteed for every single person, no matter who they were or what they looked like. Her work was more important now than ever before. As the story of Judge Vance and the disgraced officers fades, it's worth pausing to look deeper, not just at the events, but at the human failings that set them in motion. What truly drove a young officer like James Miller? It wasn't just simple racism, though that was clearly the fuel. It was a profound, corrosive insecurity. In his world, power and respect were tied to a specific image, an image that Judge Vance, with her success, her confidence, and her very existence, defied. He saw in her not a citizen to be protected, but a challenge to his own fragile sense of authority. Confronted with the truth of her identity, his ego couldn't accept the error. The lie, "It must be a fake," wasn't just a legal tactic, it was a desperate attempt to rebuild the shattered walls of his own prejudice. His downfall came not just from his actions, but from his inability to see the world as it was, rather than how he needed it to be. Could things have been different? If Judge Vance had immediately announced who she was in the elevator, perhaps the officers would have backed down in fear. But should she have had to? A citizen's right to safety and dignity shouldn't depend on their professional status. What if she had reacted with anger, shouting at their injustice? In our world, that anger, however justified, likely would have been twisted and used against her, painting her as the aggressive and uncooperative subject they wanted her to be. Her calm, disciplined response, born of a lifetime of navigating such biases, was her best and perhaps only defense. It highlights a heartbreaking truth. For many, the burden of de-escalation falls not on the aggressor with the weapon, but on the victim with the least power. The ultimate message of this story is not one of despair, but of accountability. It shows that while prejudice and abuse of power exist, so do the mechanisms of justice. The cameras, the good captain, the federal investigators, and the jury, they all represent the system working as it should. It reminds us that evidence matters, integrity matters, and courage. The courage to stand firm in the face of injustice, to document it, and to trust in the process is the essential ingredient that allows justice to prevail. It may come late, it may come at a great personal cost, but it does not, and it must not, miss its mark. This was a heavy story, and I thank you for following it. It makes you think about how quickly a normal day can turn into a life-altering event. What part of Judge Vance's ordeal stood out to you the most? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's authority was so completely misjudged? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd be honored to read them. And if stories about justice and accountability matter to you, please consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this.